The great crystal halls of the Galactic Harmony Council stretched across 3 kilometers of polished stone. 847 different species had representatives here, from tiny insect-like beings that rode in floating bubbles to massive whale creatures that needed water tanks to survive. The air itself was a carefully controlled mixture that could support most life forms, though many still wore breathing apparatus. Elder Prime Zeth Korin stood at the center podium, his crystalline body catching the light from 7 different suns that shone through the transparent dome above. His voice resonated through translation devices that converted his mineral-based communication into sounds, thoughts, and chemical signals that all species could understand. The Council has maintained peace for 300 years, he announced to the assembled delegates. Logic and order have prevented war across 12 spiral arms of our galaxy. In the human section, Ambassador Elena Vasquez sat quietly with her small team. At 45 years old, she had silver streaks in her black hair and laugh lines around her dark eyes. Next to the towering insectoid Clithtar representatives and the flowing energy beings from the Andromeda sectors, the humans looked almost comically small and ordinary. Today we celebrate another successful mediation, Zeth Korin continued. The trade dispute between Sector 7 and the Methane Collective has been resolved through proper application of Council Protocol 847B. Elena knew the real story. 3 weeks ago, the Methane Collective had been ready to cut all ties with the oxygen-breathing worlds. The logical solution proposed by the Council computers would have destroyed both economies. Elena had spent days talking to both sides, not about trade numbers or shipping routes, but about pride, fear, and trust. The Methane Collective felt ignored because all meetings were held in oxygen-rich environments. The Sector 7 representatives felt the methane beings saw them as inferior because they needed suits to survive in methane atmospheres. Elena had suggested rotating meeting locations, and had both sides share stories about their homeworlds during breaks. Simple human psychology, but it worked. The Council records would show that Protocol 847B had solved everything. Elena's work would be a footnote, if mentioned at all. Dr. James Chen, Elena's chief assistant, leaned over and whispered, "That's the 17th impossible case we've fixed this year. Think anyone will notice?" Elena shook her head slightly. After 50 years of human membership in the Council, most species still saw them as the new kids who had gotten lucky a few times. Humans lived such short lives compared to most Council species that they were seen as unstable and temporary. The Zephyrians like Zeth Korin lived for thousands of years and thought in terms of centuries. The Axiom Collective machines had perfect memory banks going back millions of years. The Neptunians existed as gas clouds that could split and merge, making them nearly immortal. To them, humans were like mayflies, here one day, gone the next. Yet somehow, these short-lived mayflies had become the Council's go-to problem solvers. Elena remembered her first case 10 years ago. 2 species had been fighting over a star system for decades. The Rigel Hawks were proud warrior poets who saw the system as a place of honor and beauty. The Dirt Movers were practical engineers who wanted to mine the asteroids for rare metals. Every logical solution had failed because each side felt their core values were being attacked. Elena had asked each group to explain why the system mattered to them, not in terms of resources or territory, but in terms of what it meant to their hearts. The Hawks spoke of ancient poems written about those stars. The Dirt Movers talked about how mining was their art form, their way of creating beauty from raw stone. Elena had suggested that the Hawks could write new poems about the magnificent structures the Dirt Movers would build, while the Dirt Movers could create artistic sculptures from the metals, inspired by Hawk poetry. Both species loved the idea. The warriors became patrons of mining art. The engineers became builders of poetic monuments. The Council computers had labeled this as Resource Allocation Solution 445C. They completely missed the point. The human delegation will now present their monthly report, Zeth Korin announced. Elena stood and walked to the smaller speaking platform designated for junior species. The translation device hummed as it prepared to convert her words into hundreds of different communication methods. "The Council's wisdom continues to bring peace to our galaxy," she began, using the formal phrases that were expected. "Humanity is honored to assist in small ways. She could have mentioned that humans had quietly prevented 12 potential conflicts in the past month. She could have explained how human psychologists and anthropologists had identified early warning signs that the Council's logical systems had missed completely. She could have talked about the late nights her team spent learning about alien cultures, not just their languages and customs, but their hopes, fears, and dreams. Instead, she gave the brief, humble report that the Council expected. Humans had helped with minor administrative tasks and cultural clarifications. Their work was described in the same way someone might describe filing paperwork or cleaning windows. After the session ended, Elena walked through the Council's vast corridors with Dr. Chen and her communications specialist, Sarah Kim. Other species moved past them without acknowledgement. To the crystal beings, humans were too soft and emotional. To the machine collectives, humans were too unpredictable and illogical. To the gas creatures, humans were too solid and limited. Ever feel like we're invisible? Sarah asked. Sometimes I think that's our greatest strength, Elena replied. Watching a group of Zephyrian delegates argue about trade regulations in perfectly logical terms that completely ignored the emotional needs of the species affected. They don't see us coming. Elena had spent her career studying what humans brought to the galactic community. It wasn't advanced technology. Dozens of species were far ahead of humanity. In that area, it wasn't military might. Humans were physically weaker than most council species. It wasn't even intelligence. At least not the kind that could be measured by tests and computers. What humans had was something most other species had evolved past or never developed. The ability to understand what others were really feeling. Even when those others were completely alien, humans could look at a crystal being and somehow sense its frustration. They could listen to a machine collective and hear the loneliness underneath the logic. They could watch gas creatures interact and recognize the patterns of joy and sorrow. Other species called this primitive emotion or illogical empathy. They tolerated it because, somehow, it worked. Elena knew that one day the Council might realize what humans actually contributed to galactic peace. But today was not that day. Today, humans remained the invisible mediators, the problem solvers whose methods were too mysterious for others to understand or respect. Tomorrow, there would be new conflicts to resolve, new hearts to heal, new bridges to build between species that had never learned how to truly see each other. And humans would be ready. The emergency alert filled the council halls with flashing red lights and warning sounds that could be heard, felt, or chemically sensed by all species present. Elena Vasquez rushed into the main chamber, still fastening her formal council jacket. Around her, delegates from hundreds of worlds were taking their positions with worried expressions. Elder Prime Zeth Korin's crystalline form pulsed with agitated colors as he addressed the assembly. The Kethtar Empire has issued an ultimatum. They demand immediate withdrawal from the Velnari mining agreement, or they will leave the council within 7 standard days. Elena felt her stomach drop. The Kethtar were one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. If they left the council, it would create a power vacuum that could destabilize entire sectors. Worse, other warrior species might follow their lead. Dr. Chen leaned over to Elena. Didn't we just finalize that mining agreement last month? Both sides seemed happy with the terms. Doc. Elena shook her head. Something was wrong. The Kethtar were proud and honor-focused, but they weren't unreasonable. They wouldn't threaten to leave over a mining dispute unless something deeper was happening. The logical solution is clear, announced Zeth Korin. We will implement Resource Allocation Protocol 892 and distribute the mining rights based on mathematical efficiency. Both species will receive optimal benefits according to their needs and capabilities. Around the chamber, other delegates nodded in agreement. The crystal beings loved logical solutions. The machine collectives processed the data and confirmed the mathematical validity. The gas creatures flowed in patterns that indicated approval. Elena stood up. Request permission to investigate the situation firsthand before implementing any protocols. Zeth Korin's crystalline form dimmed slightly. Investigation is unnecessary. The facts are clear. The Kethtar want more mining rights than the agreement allows. The Velnari refuse to give up their assigned territories. Mathematics will provide the fair solution. With respect, Elder Prime, may I speak directly with both species before we proceed? Sometimes there are details that don't show up in the official reports. There was a long pause. Elena could feel the impatience of the other delegates. To them, she was just a human suggesting more time-wasting emotional analysis. Very well, Zethkorin finally agreed. You have 2 days, but if no progress is made, we will proceed with the logical protocol. Elena left immediately for the Kethtar home system. Their ships were magnificent things, sleek predators built for speed and combat, but decorated with intricate artistic patterns that told the stories of great battles and heroic deeds. The Kethtar themselves were tall humanoids covered in natural armor, with fierce golden eyes and ceremonial scars that marked their achievements. War leader Thoktor received Elena in his command ship's honor chamber. The walls were covered with weapons and banners from 1,000 victories, but Elena noticed something interesting. Many of the newest banners didn't show battle scenes. They showed Kethtar warriors protecting civilians, defending trade routes, and helping other species during disasters. Ambassador Elena, Thoktor said in accented but clear standard, I am surprised the council sent anyone to speak with us. Usually they just send computer messages. Elena sat in the chair offered to her, noting that it had been sized for humans, a sign of respect and preparation. War leader, I'm trying to understand what changed. Last month, your people seemed satisfied with the mining agreement. Thoktor's golden eyes flashed with something that looked like hurt pride. The agreement itself was acceptable, but the way it was given to us. He paused, clearly struggling with how to explain. Tell me what happened, Elena said gently. We received a data packet, Thoktor said. Computer-generated, assigned by efficiency algorithms, like we were just another number in their calculations. The Velnari received the same thing. No ceremony. No recognition. No request for our participation. Just assignment. Elena began to understand. The Kethtar were warriors, but they were also a culture built around honor and personal recognition. Being assigned a task by a computer was like being told they were no different from mining equipment. She spent the next day traveling to the Velnari collective. Their ship was the complete opposite of the Kethtar vessels, a living organism that pulsed gently through space, its surface covered with peaceful gardens and meditation chambers. The Velnari themselves were plant-like beings who shared a collective consciousness but maintained individual personalities. Elder Bloom Niratel welcomed Elena in a chamber filled with singing flowers and gentle streams. We are troubled by the Kethtar anger, she said, her voice like wind through leaves. We seek only peace and mutual benefit. What concerns your people about the current situation? Elena asked. The mining agreement treats us as equals to the Kethtar, Niratel said sadly. But they are warriors. Their history is violence and conquest. How can the Council expect us to work alongside those who solve problems with weapons? We feel exposed, vulnerable. Elena spent hours talking with both species separately, and slowly, the real problem became clear. The Council's computer had created a perfectly logical mining agreement, but it had completely ignored the emotional needs of both sides. The Kethtar felt dishonored because they were being treated like hired workers instead of proud allies. The Velnari felt endangered because they were being forced to work with a species they saw as violent and unpredictable. Neither side was actually unhappy with the mining arrangement itself. They were unhappy with what it said about how the Council saw them. Elena had an idea. She requested a meeting with both species together, which surprised everyone since previous joint sessions had ended in shouting matches. She met with them on a neutral trading station, in a conference room she had personally arranged. But instead of the usual sterile council meeting room, Elena had asked for a ceremonial space with elements important to both cultures. War leader Thoktor, Elder Bloom Niratel, Elena began. The council has a new proposal. Instead of a mining agreement, we're asking for something much more important. Both leaders looked surprised. Elena turned to Thoktor. The council formally requests that the Kethtar Empire accept the honor of protecting and defending the Velnari people during the mining operation. Your warriors would ensure the safety of peaceful beings who cannot defend themselves. Tor straightened with pride. This wasn't a job assignment. It was a request for protection. The highest honor in Kethtar culture. Elena turned to Niratel. The Council formally requests that the Velnari Collective share their gift of peaceful growth with the Kethtar people. Your knowledge of healing and harmony would help warriors find balance when they're not in battle. Niratel's flowers glowed softly. This wasn't about being forced to work with dangerous warriors. It was about offering help to souls who needed peace. Both leaders agreed immediately. The mining operation would continue exactly as planned. But now it had meaning for both cultures. The Kethtar would mine with pride. Knowing they were protecting allies, the Velnari would work in safety, knowing they were helping former warriors find inner peace. Elena returned to the council with the agreement, feeling hopeful for the first time in weeks. But when she presented the solution to the assembled delegates, Elder Prime Zethkorin looked at her with something like disapproval. "This is emotional manipulation," he said. "You have achieved the same result as our logical protocol, but through appeals to primitive feelings, rather than mathematical efficiency." Other delegates murmured, "Agreement." The crystal beings found the ceremony wasteful. The machine collectives saw the emotional elements as unnecessary complications. The Council will implement Resource Allocation Protocol 892 as originally planned, Zethkorin announced. Logic must prevail over emotion. Elena watched in growing horror as the Council voted to ignore everything she had accomplished and return to their computer-generated solution. Within hours, both the Kethtar and Velnari had withdrawn from the agreement entirely. The algorithmic solution failed within 48 hours. Elena watched the reports flood in from her office overlooking the council chambers. The Kethtar had declared the automated resource allocation an insult to their honor, being treated like machinery instead of respected allies. The Velnari saw it as proof that the council cared more about efficiency than their well-being, forcing them into dangerous situations without considering their peaceful nature. Both fleets were now moving toward the disputed mining sector. Intelligence reports suggested the Kethtar warships would arrive first, followed by Velnari defensive vessels. For the first time in 3 centuries, the galaxy was hours away from actual warfare between council species. Dr. Chen burst into Elena's office without knocking. "The emergency session has been called. They want us in the main chamber immediately." Elena gathered her files and walked through corridors filled with panicking delegates. The air recycling systems worked overtime as species with different atmospheric needs crowded together, all demanding immediate action. The main chamber buzzed with hundreds of conversations in dozens of languages. Elder Prime Zethkorin stood at the center podium, his crystalline form flickering between colors as he tried to maintain order. "The situation has escalated beyond acceptable parameters," he announced. "All previous diplomatic solutions have failed. The Council now faces its first military conflict in 300 years. A delegate from the insectoid Kethtar hive mind clicked urgently. "The Kethtar fleet has weapons powered and ready. They're treating this as a matter of species honor now, not just mining rights. The Velnari collective mind is fracturing under stress," reported a gaseous Neptunian representative. "They're preparing to defend themselves, which goes against their fundamental peaceful nature. This could cause permanent psychological damage to their species." Zethkorin's form pulsed with urgent reds and oranges. "We require immediate human intervention. Ambassador Vasquez, your team has successfully resolved this type of cultural conflict before. Please contact both fleets and begin mediation." Elena stood slowly. Around her, hundreds of alien eyes, sensors, and consciousness tendrils focused on her small human form. For 50 years, this had been the pattern. The Council would ignore human advice, implement logical solutions that failed to account for emotional realities, then call for humans to fix the mess when everything went wrong. "I'm afraid we can't help this time," Elena said quietly. The chamber fell silent. Translation devices hummed as they processed her words into hundreds of different communication methods. "Explain this refusal," Zethkorin demanded. "The Council requires immediate assistance. 3 days ago, I presented both species with a solution that honored their cultural needs while achieving the Council's practical goals. You rejected it as emotional manipulation and chose to implement a logical protocol that ignored the underlying issues. The natural result is what you're seeing now. Elder Nexus Prime, a machine collective representative, spoke in precise digital tones. Previous human intervention success rates were 97.3%. Current crisis parameters match 17 previous scenarios that humans resolved successfully. Your assistance is logically required. Elena looked around the chamber at all the species that had dismissed human methods as primitive for half a century. You want logic? Here's logic. If you don't value our methods when times are peaceful, why should we provide them when times are desperate? The question hung in the air like a challenge no one knew how to answer. The Council commands your cooperation, Zethkorin said, his voice taking on official authority. The Council can't command what it doesn't understand or respect, Elena replied. She gathered her files and walked toward the exit. Dr. Chen, Sarah, we're leaving. Elena's team followed her out of the chamber, leaving behind a room full of confused and increasingly desperate delegates. What Elena didn't tell them was that this moment had been planned for months. The human exodus had actually begun 3 months earlier, the day after the Council had dismissed Elena's successful mediation between the Rigel Hawks and the Dirt Movers as primitive psychology. Elena had gone home that night and sent a single encrypted message to every human settlement, embassy, and research station in Council space. Evaluation phase complete. Begin transition protocols. End quote. ATZO. Humans didn't make dramatic announcements or issue ultimatums. They simply started quietly closing their accounts, finishing their projects, and transferring their responsibilities to other species. Every contract termination was handled through proper channels. Every departure was documented, according to Council regulations. Every resignation was submitted with appropriate notice periods. The beauty of it was that humans did everything exactly by the rules. No one could accuse them of breaking protocols or violating agreements. They were simply exercising their legal right to end their voluntary participation in Council activities. Dr. Chen had spent weeks carefully reviewing every human commitment throughout Council space. Sarah Kim had coordinated with communications specialists on hundreds of worlds to ensure all automated systems were transferred to other species. Elena herself had worked with human ambassadors across the galaxy to plan a synchronized withdrawal that would leave no critical systems without coverage. The process was so gradual and properly documented that the Council's administrative systems never flagged it as unusual. Individual cases looked like normal personnel changes. Only when viewed as a whole pattern did the exodus become obvious. Elena returned to her apartment in the diplomatic quarter and activated a secure communication channel. On her screen, faces appeared from across the galaxy. Every human ambassador, station commander, research director, and community leader in Council space. Phase 3 begins now, she said simply. Thank you all for your service. See you on the other side. One by one, the human facilities went dark. Not destroyed, not damaged, just empty. Embassy buildings stood pristine with their doors unlocked and all systems functioning, but no humans inside. Research stations continued their automated operations, but the scientists were gone. Trade centers kept their lights on and their computers running, but the offices were vacant. When Council security teams investigated, they found everything in perfect order. Personal belongings had been left behind. Clothes, books, family photos, even favorite coffee mugs still sitting in kitchen sinks. It looked like the humans had simply stepped out for a moment and would be back any time. But the humans were never coming back. The few non-human friends of humanity received brief, identical messages. We are departing. Take care of yourselves. Remember that understanding is more valuable than logic. No coordinates were given. No forwarding addresses were left. No explanations were provided. Within 72 hours, every human in Council space had vanished. The Kethtar and Velnari fleets reached the mining sector and found themselves facing each other with no mediators to help them communicate. Both sides wanted to avoid violence, but neither knew how to reach out to the other without losing face. Small skirmishes began within hours. Elder Prime Zeth Korin stood in his private chamber, staring out at the empty human embassy building visible through his crystal window. For the first time in his 1,000-year life, he felt something that his logical mind couldn't categorize or process. Later, other species would call it regret. Emergency sessions were called. Search fleets were dispatched. Communication attempts were made on every known frequency. But the humans had vanished as quietly and completely as they had once prevented wars, leaving behind only the growing realization that something irreplaceable had been lost. The galaxy was about to learn what peace looked like without the invisible mediators who had maintained it. The first shots were fired 6 days after the humans disappeared. A Keith Tar patrol ship, trying to establish a defensive perimeter around the disputed mining sector, accidentally crossed into what the Velnari considered sacred space near their flowering meditation gardens. The Velnari defensive grid activated automatically, sending warning bursts of energy that the Kethtar interpreted as hostile fire. Within hours, both sides had called in reinforcements. Elder Prime Zeth Korin stood in the Council's crisis center, watching the tactical displays with growing horror. Red dots representing Kethtar battle cruisers faced off against green dots showing Velnari bioships. Both fleets maintained firing positions while their commanders demanded Council intervention. Deploy peacekeeping protocols, Zeth Korin ordered. Peacekeeping protocols require cultural liaison officers, reported the computer system. No qualified personnel available. Then send our standard diplomatic team. Standard diplomatic team requires cultural advisors for non-standard species interaction. No qualified personnel available. Zeth Korin's crystalline form flickered with frustrated colors. Every peacekeeping system in the Council database required human input at some level. For 3 centuries, that had never been a problem because humans were always available. Now the gaps in their systematic knowledge became painfully obvious. The machine collective representative, Elder Nexus Prime, processed data streams from the conflict zone, attempting direct logical communication with both fleets, establishing mathematical parameters for resource sharing. The response from War Leader Thoktor was immediate and furious. We do not negotiate with machines about matters of honor. Send us someone who understands the heart of a warrior. The Velnari collective's reply was equally firm, but more sorrowful. Cold calculations cannot heal the wounds between species. We need someone who knows how to build trust, not someone who builds equations. Elder Nexus Prime's mechanical components whirred with confusion. Cultural requirements exceed logical parameters. Unable to establish productive communication framework. The first casualties came 12 hours later. Not deaths, thankfully, but a Kethtar honor guard had been injured in a collision with a Velnari bioship that had been trying to avoid conflict. Both sides blamed the other for the accident. Zeth Korin called an emergency council session, but for the first time in centuries, the delegates couldn't agree on a response. Without humans to explain the cultural nuances of the conflict, each species interpreted the situation through their own perspective. The crystalline Zephyrians proposed mathematical resource division. The gaseous Neptunians suggested dissolving the territorial boundaries entirely. The machine collectives wanted to implement automated conflict resolution protocols. The plant-based Floron delegates recommended patience and slow growth toward understanding. Every suggestion made sense from each species' point of view, but none addressed what the Kethtar and Velnari actually needed to resolve their differences. Dr. Niratel, a Zephyrian researcher who had worked with humans before, stood up in the session. We need to understand what the humans would have done in this situation. The humans are gone, Zeth Korin replied. We must find logical solutions that do not depend on emotional manipulation. But their methods worked, Niratel insisted. Perhaps we dismissed them too quickly. Around the chamber, other delegates began to murmur. A few species had started reviewing their historical files, looking for patterns in how humans had resolved previous conflicts. What they found was disturbing. The Andorian trade wars of 15 years ago had been resolved when human negotiators convinced both sides that fighting was hurting innocent civilians. The Sector 12 territorial dispute had ended when humans helped each species understand the other's historical trauma. The great mining conflict of Rigel VII had been settled when humans found a way for both sides to work together while maintaining their cultural identity. In every case, the official council records credited logical protocols and mathematical resource allocation. But when species looked deeper into their own records, they found evidence of extensive human involvement that had never been properly documented. "They were fixing problems we didn't even know existed," whispered a delegate from the Methane Collective. Elder Nexus Prime accessed historical databases and ran pattern analysis programs. The results were undeniable. In the 50 years since humans joined the Council, major conflicts had decreased by 67%. Minor disputes that could escalate into larger problems had been reduced by 89%. Species satisfaction with council mediation had improved by 43%. Correlation analysis suggests significant causal relationship between human presence and conflict prevention, Elder Nexus Prime announced to the Chamber. Previous assumptions about human contribution to galactic stability were insufficient, but the damage was already spreading beyond the Keth-Tar-Velnari crisis. On the far rim of Council space, the silicon mines and the carbon communities were having a trade dispute that had been quietly managed by human economists for years. Without human cultural translation, both sides reverted to their fundamental misunderstanding. The silicon mines couldn't grasp why organic beings needed rest periods, while the carbon communities couldn't understand how digital consciousness could have emotional needs. Trade ships began refusing to dock at each other's stations. In Sector 9, the Hive Queens and the Individual Freedom Alliance had maintained an uneasy peace for decades, with human diplomats helping each side understand that collective consciousness and individual identity could coexist. Without that mediation, old fears resurfaced. The Hive Queens began to see individualists as dangerously chaotic. The Alliance began to view hive minds as threats to personal liberty. Border checkpoints started demanding additional security screenings. Near the Galactic Center, the ancient Eternals and the young innovators had different approaches to technological development that had been balanced by human advisors who understood both tradition and progress. Without human input, the Eternals saw innovation as dangerous rashness, while the innovators viewed tradition as stagnant conservatism. Research sharing agreements began to crumble. Each conflict seemed small and manageable on its own, but Zeth Korin began to see the pattern. For 50 years, humans had been the invisible threads holding the galactic community together. They hadn't just resolved major conflicts, they had prevented hundreds of smaller disagreements from growing into major problems. Computer, analyze Council stability projections assuming continued human absence. Zeth Korin ordered from his private chamber. The results appeared on his crystal display. Current trajectory indicates 67% probability of Council dissolution within 18 standard months, 89% probability of return to pre-Council territorial warfare within 36 standard months. Zeth Korin stared at the numbers. 3 centuries of peace ended because they had failed to value the species that had made it possible. Emergency search fleets were dispatched to find the missing humans, but they had vanished completely. No warp signatures, no communication traces, no evidence of their destination. It was as if they had simply stepped outside of reality itself. Desperate attempts were made to replicate human mediation techniques. The Council hired cultural specialists from other species and programmed computers with human psychological theories. But without the intuitive understanding that humans seem to possess naturally, every attempt failed. The Zephyrians approached conflicts with pure logic and missed the emotional undercurrents. The machine collectives processed cultural data but couldn't grasp the subtle feelings behind the facts. The gaseous beings could sense emotions but couldn't translate them into solutions that solid matter species could understand. As reports of new conflicts poured in from across the galaxy, Elder Prime Zeth Korin realized something that shook his crystalline core. Humans hadn't been junior partners in the Council's success. They had been the foundation that made everything else possible, and now that foundation was gone. 8 months after the humans vanished, the Galactic Harmony Council held its final emergency session. The great crystal halls that had once housed representatives from 847 species now echoed with barely half that number. Empty sections marked where entire civilizations had withdrawn from the council, choosing isolation over continued participation in what they saw as a failing institution. Elder Prime Zethkorin stood at the center podium, but his crystalline form had lost much of its inner light. Around him, the remaining delegates looked exhausted and defeated. 8 months of constant crisis had worn down even the most patient species. The Keth-Tarvel-Nari conflict had ended 3 months ago, but not through any council mediation. Both species had fought until they were too tired to continue, then agreed to split the mining system in half with a buffer zone between them. It worked, but barely, and both sides remained suspicious of each other. That pattern had repeated across the galaxy. Species were finding their own solutions to problems, but without the understanding and trust that human mediators had helped build, every resolution felt temporary and fragile. 47 new conflicts have erupted this month, reported Elder Nexus Prime, the Machine Collective representative. Previous month showed 51 new conflicts. Conflict resolution rate remains at 23% success, compared to 97% during human-mediated period. The numbers told the story. Without humans, the Council could still solve problems through logic and force, but they couldn't heal the underlying wounds that caused the problems in the first place. Every solution left behind resentment and misunderstanding that would eventually explode into new conflicts. Dr. Nira Tell, the Zephyrian researcher who had studied human methods, stood up. Have our long-range search fleets found any trace of human location? Negative, replied Captain Thixnal of the Clithtar Hive Fleet. We have searched 700 star systems beyond Council borders. No warp signatures, no communication signals, no evidence of human presence. They have disappeared beyond our ability to track. What about our attempts to replicate human mediation techniques? Asked a delegate from the Methane Collective. Elder Nexus Prime's mechanical voice carried an unusual tone that almost sounded like sadness. Cultural simulation programs have achieved 8% success rate in conflict resolution. Emotional analysis algorithms remain non-functional. Empathy training for council mediators has produced minimal improvement. We cannot replicate what humans did naturally. Zethkorin looked around the diminished chamber. Then we must accept that the great experiment is ending. The Galactic Harmony Council cannot maintain peace without the foundation that made peace possible. Suddenly, the main communication system activated. Every delegate looked up as an unknown signal filled the chamber. Static cleared, and a familiar voice spoke clearly through the translation devices. Elder Prime Zethkorin and members of the Galactic Harmony Council. This is Ambassador Elena Vasquez. The chamber fell completely silent. For 8 months, every attempt to contact the missing humans had met with silence. Now, suddenly, Elena's voice reached them across the vastness of space. We know that you have been searching for us, Elena continued. We know about the conflicts that have erupted since our departure. We know that the Council is facing dissolution. We want you to understand why we left, and why we cannot return. Zethkorin activated the recording systems. Whatever Elena said might be the last communication between humans and the Council. For 50 years, we believed that empathy and understanding could bridge any gap between intelligent species, Elena said. Her voice sounded older, more tired, but also somehow more peaceful. We helped you resolve conflicts while watching you dismiss our methods as primitive emotions. We prevented wars while you credited your logical protocols. We built trust between species while you focused on resource allocation algorithms. Around the chamber, delegates shifted uncomfortably. Many were remembering specific incidents where they had dismissed human contributions. We hoped that eventually, you would see the value in what we offered. We thought that if we proved our worth through results, you would come to respect our approach. We were wrong. Elena paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was firm, but not angry. You wanted logic? Here is your logic. A civilization that cannot value understanding will never truly understand itself. You achieved 3 centuries of peace not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through the patient work of building relationships between different ways of thinking. When you rejected that approach as primitive, you rejected the very foundation of your success. Dr. Niratel stood up. Ambassador Vasquez, please. The Council has learned from its mistakes. We now understand what humans contributed to galactic peace. We formally request your return and offer full recognition of human mediation methods as valid Council protocols. Elena's response was gentle but final. Dr. Niratel, we appreciate your words. But respect that comes only after loss is not true respect. It is desperation. Where are you? Zeth Korin asked urgently. Perhaps we can meet and discuss terms for rebuilding our relationship. We have found others, Elena said simply. Beyond the rim of your galaxy, there are civilizations that understand the value of empathy from the beginning. Species that see emotional intelligence as evolution, not regression. Beings that know the difference between logic and wisdom. The implications hit the chamber like a physical blow. Humanity hadn't just left the Council. They had found something better. We are building something new, Elena continued. A community based on understanding rather than efficiency. A society that solves problems by healing hearts, as well as managing resources. We wish you well in your future endeavors. Wait, called out a delegate from the Young Innovators faction. Can you at least teach us? Show us how to do what you did? Elena's final words came after a long pause. You cannot learn empathy through instruction manuals. You cannot download understanding through data transfers. You cannot program wisdom into computers. These things must be felt, experienced, and practiced until they become part of who you are. The humans who could have taught you, that are gone. The ones who remain have moved beyond the need to prove their worth to those who could never see it. The transmission ended. For several minutes, no one in the chamber spoke. The reality was undeniable. Humanity had not just left them, but had found something better and was never coming back. Elder Nexus Prime broke the silence with a statistical analysis. Communication patterns suggest human civilization has grown beyond our technological ability to track or contact. They have achieved independence from our galactic community. Independence, repeated Zeth Korin slowly. Yes, perhaps that was always their destiny. Over the following months, the Council dissolved, not with dramatic battles or angry declarations, but with quiet resignation. Species began forming smaller alliances based on compatible cultures and similar needs. Some partnerships worked well, others struggled. The Kethtar and Velnari, surprisingly, became close allies once they stopped trying to work through Council mediators and started talking directly to each other. They discovered that warrior honor and peaceful wisdom could complement each other beautifully when not filtered through logical protocols. The silicon mines and carbon communities found ways to appreciate their differences without human translation, though it took years of patient effort. The great crystal halls of the Council stood empty, preserved as a monument to an experiment that had succeeded for 3 centuries and failed when it forgot the foundation of its success. Zeth Korin visited the human embassy building one last time before returning to his home system. Everything was exactly as the humans had left it. Clean, organized, and ready for occupants who would never return. On Elena's desk, he found a small plaque that had been there for years but which he had never noticed before. It contained a quote from an ancient human philosopher. The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. For the first time in his 1,000-year existence, Zeth Korin understood what those words meant. The galaxy learned to exist without the Council, and eventually found new ways to maintain peace. But it was a different kind of peace, more fragile, requiring more effort, built on agreements rather than understanding. And somewhere beyond the rim of known space, humanity continued their real voyage of discovery, with others who had learned to see through new eyes. The Council's greatest lesson came too late to save it. That wisdom and intelligence were not the same thing, and that the most advanced civilizations were not always those with the best technology, but those with the biggest hearts. Humans had never been the junior partners in galactic peace. They had been the teachers all along.